What if I told you that modern medical psychology can explain Jesus' most impossible miracles? What if the supernatural events that shaped human history actually follow patterns we now understand through neuroscience and psychology? Today, we're diving into 3 cases that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about faith, healing, and human consciousness. These aren't attacks on belief. They're revelations about the incredible power of the human mind that science is only now beginning to understand. Get ready to see miracles through a lens that will change everything. Here's what most people don't understand about Jesus' healing miracles. They follow the exact same patterns that modern medicine now recognizes as psychosomatic healing. But here's where it gets interesting and controversial. Every single healing described in the Gospels matches conditions that we now know can be dramatically improved or even cured through psychological intervention. Think about it. Blindness that isn't congenital, paralysis without spinal damage, skin conditions, seizures. These are all conditions that modern neurology has proven can be caused or maintained by psychological trauma. When someone believes they're paralyzed due to psychological conversion disorder, they literally cannot move their limbs. The neural pathways are blocked by their mind, not their body. Jesus wasn't just a spiritual teacher. He was operating as what we'd now recognize as a master psychologist. His approach followed a precise formula that modern cognitive behavioral therapy has adopted: establishing authority, creating expectation, providing a ritual, and offering transformational identity change. Your faith has healed you wasn't religious language. It was accurate psychological diagnosis. But here's the mind-blowing part that challenges everything. Jesus understood principles of trauma therapy that took medical science 2,000 years to rediscover. He knew that healing the mind could literally heal the body. He was practicing what we now call mind-body medicine before we even knew the nervous system existed. The crowds followed him because he was getting results that seemed impossible. But were they really impossible? Or was he just the first person to truly understand the connection between belief, identity, and physical manifestation? The evidence suggests something that will shock you. Modern neuroscience has discovered something revolutionary. The placebo effect can be more powerful than most medications. When patients truly believe they're receiving healing treatment, their brains literally rewire themselves. Brain scans show increased dopamine, activated opioid receptors, and enhanced immune function. The mind doesn't just think it's healing, it actually commands the body to heal. Jesus mastered what psychologists now call therapeutic presence. His approach combined several psychological techniques that we've only recently understood. First, he used authoritative positioning. People saw him as having divine power, which neuroscience shows dramatically increases therapeutic response. Second, he employed ritual healing, the laying on of hands, spoken commands, physical actions that engaged multiple senses and created powerful psychological anchoring. But here's what's truly fascinating. Jesus specifically targeted conditions that modern medicine recognizes as psychosomatic. The woman with the bleeding disorder. Today we diagnose chronic stress-induced hormonal disruption. The paralyzed man. Classic conversion disorder from unresolved guilt and trauma. The blind man. Psychological blindness from overwhelming emotional trauma. Jesus wasn't performing supernatural miracles. He was demonstrating the supernatural power of the human psyche when properly activated. His words, "Your sins are forgiven," weren't religious ritual, they were trauma therapy. He understood that most physical ailments stem from psychological wounds, and he treated the root cause, not just the symptoms. Modern studies on spontaneous remission show that dramatic healings happen when 3 factors align: absolute belief in recovery, resolution of deep psychological conflicts, and a transformational shift in personal identity. Jesus created all 3 conditions simultaneously. He offered people a new identity as healed and forgiven, resolving their psychological conflicts while commanding absolute faith in the process. The crowds weren't witnessing violations of natural law. They were seeing the natural law of mind-body connection operating at full power. Jesus had discovered what neuroscientists now call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to literally rewire itself and command physical changes in the body through belief and emotional transformation. Think of the human brain like a computer with corrupted software. When trauma, guilt, or fear creates psychological viruses, the brain starts sending the wrong signals to the body. It might shut down movement, create pain, or trigger disease responses, even when there's no physical cause. Jesus operated like the world's first master programmer. He didn't fix the hardware. He deleted the corrupted software and installed a completely new operating system. When he said, "Your sins are forgiven," he was essentially hitting the reset button on someone's psychological programming. Imagine you're a computer that's been running a virus for years. The virus makes you think your legs don't work, so you can't walk. Someone comes along, removes the virus, and suddenly your legs work perfectly. To everyone watching, it looks like a miracle. But really, the problem was never your legs. It was the corrupted code in your brain. Modern psychology calls this conversion disorder, when the mind creates physical symptoms without physical cause. Jesus understood this 2,000 years before. We had a name for it. He knew that healing the psychological wound would automatically heal the physical symptom. This explains why his healings were instantaneous and why he focused on faith. He wasn't asking people to believe in magic. He was asking them to believe they could be healed, which neuroscience now proves is the most powerful healing force in existence. When someone truly believes they're healed at the deepest level, their brain immediately starts making it true. The miracle wasn't supernatural intervention, it was natural intervention operating at supernatural levels of effectiveness. Jesus had cracked the code of human psychology before we even knew we had psychology to crack. If this is blowing your mind, hit that like button so more people can discover these hidden truths. But wait, because the second case is even more shocking. Now, let's tackle the miracle that scientists claim is absolutely impossible, Jesus walking on water. But what if I told you that modern psychology has documented hundreds of cases where groups of people simultaneously witness events that defy physical laws? What if the real miracle wasn't supernatural physics, but supernatural psychology? Here's what mainstream thinking gets wrong. They assume that if multiple people witness something, it must be objectively real. But cognitive psychology has shattered this assumption. We now know that groups can experience collective hallucinations, shared false memories, and synchronized perceptual distortions that feel absolutely real to everyone involved. The walking on water event fits a pattern that psychologists call collective altered state experience. Under specific conditions, extreme emotional stress, sleep deprivation, intense group focus, and charismatic leadership, entire groups can enter synchronized altered states where they genuinely perceive impossible events. Think about the context. The disciples were exhausted fishermen, struggling against a storm in the middle of the night, in a heightened emotional state after recent intense experiences with Jesus. These are the exact conditions that neuroscience has proven can trigger group consciousness phenomena. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jesus understood group psychology at a level that took modern science decades to discover. He knew how to induce collective altered states that would create shared extraordinary experiences. He wasn't just a spiritual teacher. He was operating as what we'd now recognize as a master hypnotist and group dynamics specialist. The disciples weren't lying when they reported seeing Jesus walk on water. From their perspective, it absolutely happened. Their brains were in a synchronized state where shared hallucination became shared reality. Jesus had discovered how to hack group consciousness before we even knew group consciousness existed. Modern psychology calls this consensual validation. When a group collectively agrees that their shared perceptual experience is real, it becomes psychologically real for all participants, regardless of objective physical reality. Stanford University's landmark studies on group hypnosis have revealed something that changes everything. Under the right conditions, entire groups can simultaneously experience identical hallucinations that feel more real than normal reality. The participants aren't crazy. Their brains are operating in a synchronized, altered state where the normal filters of perception are bypassed. Jesus mastered what psychologists now call collective consciousness induction. His technique combined several elements that neuroscience has proven can synchronize group brain states: rhythmic speech patterns, intense eye contact, shared emotional experiences, and authoritative presence. When these factors align, individual consciousness merges into group consciousness, and extraordinary shared experiences become possible. The walking on water event shows all the markers of what researchers call folie à plusieurs, shared psychotic experience among a group with strong emotional bonds. But here's the crucial part. This isn't mental illness. It's an extraordinary state of consciousness where normal perceptual limitations are transcended through group psychological synchronization. Modern studies on collective experiences in crisis situations show that when people are under extreme stress and focused on a charismatic leader, their brains can synchronize to the point where they literally share the same perceptual reality. Military units report seeing impossible things during combat. Disaster survivors describe witnessing events that contradict physical laws. Religious groups regularly experience collective visions during intense worship. Jesus didn't walk on water. He induced a synchronized altered state where his disciples' brains collectively perceived him walking on water. The experience was psychologically real, emotionally transformative, and neurologically measurable, even though it wasn't physically real. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. His response to their amazement wasn't surprise. It was confirmation that his psychological technique had worked. He understood that creating shared, extraordinary experiences would bond his followers and establish his authority more powerfully than any logical argument. This explains why the disciples never doubted what they saw, even when questioned by skeptics. From their neurological perspective, the experience was more real than normal reality because it occurred in an enhanced state of consciousness where perceptual clarity is actually heightened, even while perceptual accuracy is distorted. Imagine, your brain is like a radio that's normally tuned to reality FM. You see things exactly as they physically exist. But under certain conditions, the radio can shift to expanded consciousness FM, where you perceive things that aren't physically there but feel more real than normal reality. Jesus was like a master radio technician who knew exactly which frequencies to use to tune multiple radios to the same expanded station simultaneously. When the disciples' brains synchronized to his frequency, they all tuned into the same expanded reality broadcast. Think of it like a shared dream. When you're dreaming, everything feels completely real. You can see, hear, touch, and interact with dream elements as if they're physical. Your brain is generating a complete reality experience without external input. Now imagine if multiple people could share the same dream while awake. That's essentially what Jesus achieved. Modern virtual reality gives us a glimpse of this phenomenon. When people put on VR headsets, they can share experiences that feel completely real but exist only in digital space. Their brains respond to virtual environments as if they're physical environments. Jesus created biological VR without technology. He used psychology to generate shared virtual experiences. This doesn't diminish the significance of the experience. The disciples genuinely witnessed something extraordinary that transformed their understanding of reality. The psychological impact was real, the spiritual transformation was real, and the bonding effect was real. The only thing that wasn't real was the physical walking on water. But here's the crucial insight. Jesus understood that psychological reality is often more powerful than physical reality. He knew that what people perceive and believe shapes their behavior more than what's objectively true. He was demonstrating advanced principles of consciousness manipulation that we're only now beginning to understand through neuroscience and quantum psychology. Subscribe now, because the third case coming up will completely change your perspective on human nature. Here's the ultimate question that has puzzled humanity for 2,000 years. How did a crucified teacher create the most powerful transformation movement in human history? But what if the real miracle of the resurrection wasn't Jesus coming back from the dead, but Jesus understanding the psychology of transformation so deeply that he could program his own legend to reshape human consciousness permanently? This is where psychology meets strategy in ways that will blow your mind. Modern studies on transformational leadership show that the most powerful leaders aren't just charismatic. They understand how to create what psychologists call post-traumatic growth in their followers. They engineer experiences that break people down and build them back up with new identities and purpose. Jesus orchestrated his death and resurrection story using principles that modern psychology has identified as the most effective transformation triggers. Intense trauma followed by miraculous recovery, death of old identity followed by rebirth of new identity, and collective witnessing of impossible events followed by shared mission purpose. But here's what most people miss. The resurrection doesn't have to be physically real to be psychologically transformational. The disciples experienced something so powerful that it completely rewired their neural networks, transforming them from fearful followers into fearless evangelists willing to die for their beliefs. Modern neuroscience has discovered that traumatic experiences followed by positive resolution create the strongest neural pathway changes in the human brain. This is why military units bond so intensely after surviving combat together, why addiction recovery programs use rock bottom followed by spiritual rebirth, and why initiation rituals involve symbolic death and resurrection. Jesus designed his death and resurrection as the ultimate psychological transformation experience. Whether he physically rose from the dead becomes irrelevant when you understand that his followers experienced complete psychological resurrection that changed the course of human history. The real question isn't whether Jesus came back from the dead. The real question is, how did he engineer a psychological transformation so powerful that it convinced hundreds of people to transform their entire identities and dedicate their lives to spreading his message, even unto death? Here's the revelation that changes everything. Jesus understood mass psychology at a level that would make modern marketing executives weep with envy. He didn't just create a religion, he created the most successful psychological transformation program in human history using techniques that took behavioral science 2,000 years to identify and understand. The resurrection story follows what psychologists now call the hero's journey transformation model. Departure from normal life, descent into death, trauma, resurrection with new powers, and return to transform others. This isn't just storytelling, it's the fundamental pattern that all psychological transformation follows. Jesus lived this pattern so perfectly that it became embedded in human consciousness as the ultimate transformation template. But here's what's truly mind-blowing. Jesus programmed his followers with what modern psychology calls emotional contagion, the ability to transmit psychological states through shared experience. Every person who encountered the disciples experienced some level of the same transformation that the disciples themselves had undergone. This created an exponential spreading effect that modern viral marketing can only dream of achieving. The disciples weren't just sharing a story. They were transmitting a psychological state. They had been so completely transformed by their Jesus experience that their presence alone could trigger transformation in others. Modern neuroscience calls this mirror neuron activation. When someone who has undergone deep transformation interacts with others, their neural patterns actually influence and reshape the neural patterns of the people around them. Jesus understood something that took modern psychology decades to discover. The most powerful way to change the world isn't through logic or force, but through psychological transformation that spreads person to person like a beneficial virus. He created what researchers now call a psychological epidemic of transformation. The crucifixion and resurrection story wasn't just religious narrative, it was applied psychology designed to create maximum transformation in minimum time. By experiencing symbolic death and rebirth with Jesus, his followers underwent complete identity reconstruction that made them psychologically unstoppable. This explains why Christianity spread so rapidly and survived persecution. The followers weren't just believing in Jesus, they had been psychologically transformed into versions of Jesus. They carried his psychological patterns within their own neural networks and transmitted them everywhere they went. Think of psychological transformation like a computer virus, but a beneficial one. Jesus didn't just teach people ideas. He infected them with a complete psychological operating system that rewrote their core programming. Imagine that Jesus was like a master programmer who created the most effective personal transformation software ever designed. The crucifixion and resurrection weren't just historical events. They were the ultimate beta test of his transformation program. When it worked perfectly on his disciples, turning them from scared followers into fearless leaders, he knew the program was ready for mass distribution. Every person the disciples encountered was essentially being offered a download of the Jesus transformation software. Some people's systems were compatible, and they underwent complete personality transformation. Others were incompatible and rejected the download. But those who successfully installed the program became carriers who could spread it to others. This is exactly how modern transformation movements work. Whether it's addiction recovery, personal development, or spiritual awakening, the most effective programs don't just teach techniques. They trigger complete identity transformation that becomes self-perpetuating and contagious. Jesus understood that sustainable change doesn't come from external rules or beliefs. It comes from internal transformation so complete that the person literally becomes a different version of themselves. He created a transformation experience so powerful that it could replicate itself across cultures and centuries. The miracle of Christianity isn't supernatural intervention, it's supernatural psychology. Jesus discovered how to hack human consciousness at such a fundamental level that his psychological programming is still running in billions of human minds 2,000 years later. He didn't just change individual lives, he uploaded new software into the collective human consciousness that permanently altered how we think about love, forgiveness, sacrifice, and transformation. Whether you're religious or not, you're running some version of Jesus' psychological programming because it became embedded in Western civilization's collective consciousness. These three cases reveal something that will shatter everything you thought you knew about miracles, faith, and human potential. Jesus wasn't performing supernatural magic. He was demonstrating supernatural psychology. He understood the power of the human mind to heal bodies, share consciousness, and transform identity at levels that modern science is only beginning to comprehend. If these three cases exploded your mind, smash that like button and subscribe to never miss our next mysteries. Tell us in the comments, which revelation surprised you most? Hit the bell so the algorithm doesn't lie to you. If you know someone who needs to see this, share it, because these truths need to be known. The mind is more powerful than we ever imagined. This analysis is speculative and based on historical records and psychological theories, not clinical diagnosis.